Hey everyone. So chapter 12 is about the arbitration process. And basically what happens is if you when it, with the most collective bargaining agreements, the last step in the process, if something can't be resolved, no matter what it is, it usually goes to what we call arbitration. And think of arbitration basically as a mini court case. Where both parties will agree to somebody who's called an arbitrator, and that person basically acts like a judge. They will hear both sides of the argument, and then they will make a decision based on the evidence that is presented. Very, very similar to a court case. Now, obviously, like in a court case, there's no jury with an arbitration. It's usually just one person, and at times a lot of times there can be three people. So that way, a decision always will have a 2-1 or a 3-0, for example. So you rarely ever see an even number of arbitrators. So for that reason. So as such, the arbitrator usually has the final decision. So whatever the arbitrator says, that is what both parties, what is agreed to, and that's what it's going to be moving forward. Now, there are cases where if one or both parties feel like the arbitrator was, broke some law, or was so biased towards one side, or something egregious, they can take it and file a court case with it. But again, that tends not to happen very often because arbitration is designed to take a lot of these disputes out of the court system and make it easier to manage. So there's and especially towards the end of the chapter, it goes into a lot of the procedures that happen with the arbitration. And I don't want you to worry as much about excuse me, the procedures, because again, that gets a little detailed and it's a little outside the scope of this course. If we were more in an advanced labor class, we would go into that much more in detail. But for purposes of chapter 12, there's a couple things that I want you to keep in mind. First is what we call past practice. Generally when an arbitrator is hearing a case, a lot of times, when a rule or anything is unclear, they'll look at past practice to determine what should be the case. So for example, if a company, for the last 25 years has given all employees Christmas Day off, and then this year they decide to make everybody work, and the union files a grievance on that, the union can come back and say, look, for the past 25 years, every Christmas we've been given off, and now they're making us work. So that could be an argument the union can make as far as like past practice. We've always done it this way. It's always been this way. So we need to keep, these types of details going. So that is something that arbitrators tend to look at as what we call past practice. And kind of related to past practice, they do what they call common law of the shop. And that's another term that's in your textbook, common law of the shop. Similar to past practice, but again, the whole idea is that, the whole idea behind common law of the shop is that, what has generally happened, procedures or, things that have kind of happened that could make sense. For example, let's say that, somebody who's on a machine line, it does the exact same 5 steps, forever. And then all of a sudden, something has changed and it makes it harder for them to do their job, or they're unable to do their job. Well, that can be grieved or taken to arbitration, and then the union can say, like, look, the common law and the common practices, they do these 5 steps. Changing it all of a sudden could put the worker in danger. It could, things like along those lines. So that's kind of what we think of when we think of common law of the shop. Kind of what is similar to past practice, if you will. And this is a legal term, but your book talks about something called parole evidence. Generally, parole evidence it's usually an arbitrator will usually let it in, but they can decide not to include it if they want. And that usually tends to be stuff that's brought in from the outside. So let's say you have we'll call it a factory that produces widgets, and your employees work at that factory. Well, and they have, a process that they use, but there's the exact same process, let's say in 7 other factories, that they all do it the same way, but our factory does it differently, and it's creating other issues. An arbitrator can can bring that evidence that's outside of the factory, that brings other employers into it, and say, well, based on this thing called parole evidence, it makes sense that everybody else in the industry does this, so maybe we should do it the same here. So again, it's bringing stuff outside the contract, bringing stuff from the outside world into to help support a claim one way or the other. That's called parole evidence. So after both sides have, made their arguments, brought in their witnesses, presented their evidence, then, the arbitrator makes a final decision, and that's what we call the Arbitrators Award. And that's basically, think of it as a judge giving out a sentence, if you will, or awarding damages like in a civil case. So the arbitrator can say, okay, let's say that it's an inappropriate firing, for example. So the arbitrator can say, okay, you have to bring this employee back. You owe him back wages. You owe him retro insurance. He gets a promotion. Whatever it is. Arbitrator has a lot of authority to determine what is fair and appropriate. So anything that the arbitrator gets is called the Arbitrators Award. And again, and generally, again, both parties agree that whatever the arbitrator decides is a binding decision. It can't be appealed from there. But there are times, where, an arbitrator could potentially exceed their authority, and then that could be brought to a court. Like, let's say somebody was fired a month ago and then just wants to get their job back. So if an arbitrator says, well, they get their job back, they get the money that they agree that they should have gotten, and I'm going to give them $10 million because, I just think they were treated so unfairly. That's kind of, egregious and outside what an arbitrator is really designed to do. So the company could probably take that to a court and get that thrown out because, again, it's the arbitrator going way, way above and beyond what they're allowed to do. So that's kind of when we think of, the power of an arbitrator, what they can decide. So, and finally in the chapter, your book talks a lot about the different procedures and, how the process works. Again, I'm not as concerned about knowing that. I just want you to kind of know the basics of arbitration and what it's designed to do. So a lot of that stuff at the end of the chapter, I don't focus too much on it because, again, it's not going to be on the final exam. I just want you to know the basics about arbitration. So thanks so much, everyone.